Hi, my name is Amy Vetter, and I'm a part of the AICPA IMTA Executive Committee and lead the Technology Innovations Task Force. And very excited to launch this new series with the AICPA to really talk about not just the technology, but how we actually implement AI, machine learning, blockchain, all these different technologies in the real world. What we need to prepare for, what things might go wrong or right during the process, and some steps that you can take to do this in your own practice or department in a corporation. Chris is on my task force as well, and our first guest to launch this new series. And Chris, do you want to give a little background on yourself and what you do?
Sure. Thanks, Amy. So I'm an audit manager with Citi's Regulatory Solutions Group. And what I do is I manage a global data tracing program where we validate the data reported to our regulators to make sure that that data is in fact accurate.
Great. So we asked Chris to come on as our first guest because what they do is so interesting within his department and how it's really transformed their processes and being able to speed up their work. But before we get into the technology, why did you get started looking for technology to really disrupt the processes internally of how you did your work?
Sure. So about a year and a half ago, we started looking at automated solutions because we're trying to move forward towards a continuous auditing format for several reasons. One, it's an expedited reporting process where we can issue our audit reports to our stakeholders in a more timely manner. And then we're also performing the test work on a quarterly basis in lieu of a risk-based audit cycle. So those risk-based audit cycles from a traditional audit perspective could be every year, 18 months, 2 years, every 3 years. We are now performing this test work on a quarterly basis.
And what were the types of problems that you were looking to solve?
Sure. So we were looking at historical data. And by the time we identified errors, there had been maybe 3 or 4 reporting cycles. So that error could have potentially already been fixed, or we've been reporting it wrong for the past few cycles.
So Chris, when you talk about that you were behind in getting information to the organization that was actually meaningful, because it might have been 3 or 4 quarters after the transaction actually occurred, and by the time you're going back and searching for issues, it might have already been resolved. So what you're trying not to do, obviously, is waste time in the organization with the things that you do and get to those answers quicker so you can be more proactive. So what was the process that you went through to request that you really wanted to change this process at Citi?
Sure. So what we initially did is we looked at the budget and actual hours it took to perform our data trace from prior years. We then went out to research tools that would help us profile the data to look for those potential exceptions versus looking at just everything as a whole, and then determined and tried to estimate how many hours we would save as an audit function using this tool and what value it would add to our businesses. We wanted to look for repeatable solutions that span across several different audit teams, not just our team. So we were looking for tools that would be useful for several other of our audit groups as well, not just us.
Okay, and so after, this then gets taken internally through a department to be approved. Once they approve the technology that was the solution for you to implement, what was the implementation process like? So you knew when you put that proposal together, this was the ROI you wanted, and it sounds awesome. But when you actually started putting it in place, what was that like? What were the steps that you took to start testing that software and getting it implemented into your processes?
Sure. From a data perspective, the businesses that we audit had their own profiling rules that they've been using for several years. However, they were very simple one-dimensional rules. So as internal audit, we developed our own profiling rules as well. So what we had to do is customize that tool to include both their profiling rules as well as ours, again, to look for those outliers, those anomalies, to see if those records or those issues were more systemic or whether they were, a one-off fat finger type of error. Granted, the one-off fat finger type errors are errors, but the systemic issues are the ones we were really looking for. And as you can imagine, with Citi, we test several different products: credit cards, mortgages, derivatives, securities. So we're looking at millions and millions of rows of data. So this tool allows us to look at everything and not just a small sample size.
And when it first came into play, did you test it on everything, or did you just take one process and test it? Like, how did you get started?
We took a smaller portfolio. For example, our securities portfolio, our available for sale and held to maturity securities portfolio is maybe $350 billion worth of securities, but there's only 16,000 different records, right? So we applied this tool using a smaller data set to see what results we got from the tool.
And what was the difference in results had you done it the way you've always done it before versus when you tested it?
Sure. Our error rate increased by about 10% from previous years.
So when you were testing the tool, what was the difference between when you did it before, prior to testing, versus when you did the same process? What was the difference that you saw?
Sure. We were identifying more anomalies, more outliers, which has allowed us to find more potential exceptions in our test work. So we identified more errors using the tool versus not using the tool.
And what could you say as you went through that process that surprised you? Like, were there some pitfalls that as you started implementing, you're like, oh, this is, we might not be able to use this, or you had to overcome some major issues in order to get it going in more of your processes?
Sure. There were some nuances with data element field names within our regulatory reporting platforms and our referential databases. So there was some mapping that needed to be done prior to using the tool. So there is some preliminary planning that needed to be done. But ease of use, I think it allowed us to identify those potential exceptions and focus our time on those potential exceptions versus maybe selecting a sample that was accurate and spending the time tracing an accurate sample, which is not useful to us or the businesses that we audit.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point you bring up, is that a lot of times when we're implementing new technology, we are excited about it and we think it's going to revolutionize things, but the beginning part is actually worse than the way things were before, because you have to spend a lot of time to set it up correctly, else it's garbage in, garbage out still, right? It's still a computer that needs to be programmed into your processes. It's not going to just know. So making sure that you spend the right amount of time to learn about what are the unique things about that software that you're using, as far as like mapping fields and what do they call it in that software versus what you're used to calling it, and how do those two correlate, et cetera, are really important so that you can get the benefit rather than abandoning at that point of like, oh, well, we're not getting what we needed from the software, instead of taking the time to understand how that software works.
That's
so
right.
What was your training like in this software so that you understood how to use it properly?
Sure. So the way it works at Citi is that we have a technology group who is helping us program those rules into the tool, working with us, who are the business users. So as I just mentioned before, we used AFS HTM portfolio as as a testing platform. So we performed some UAT prior to implementing the tool in our live test work in production. So technology has a more technical grasp on the tool, and they kind of were hand-holding in the process of showing us how to use the tool to the point where we knew how to use the tool ourselves.
Yeah, and that's really important too. So if you're not at City and in a bigger corporation and you're implementing technology, there are consulting practices that specialize in implementing technology that can work hand in hand with you to make sure you implement things right if you don't have the expertise internally. So whether it's someone internally, a group that's going to help you with implementation, or a group that you hire from the outside to help you, it's important to bring in the right skill sets so the technology is mapped correctly and properly, so that when you use the software, you're getting the full benefit. So what would you say today, now you're about a year and a half into the software, what have been the benefits of having this AI software? So it's basically data extraction, correct? So that you're not having to search through all of the data manually, that it is providing you the work of where you should spend, what's the best use of time for you and your department to spend time on for the organization. So what would you say have been the major benefits, and have you met the ROI or exceeded it or not from when you began?
So we've cut our project time in half.
Wow.
We've been able to streamline reports. So we issue now a quarterly report instead of an annual report. And we also, as I mentioned before, we focus on those potential exceptions. So we spend a lot of our time focusing on the higher risk areas and actually interacting more with our stakeholders, and hopefully adding more value to our stakeholders and to City as a whole.
Now, you know, when you say you cut 50% of your time, there's always that fear moment of, does that mean if I put technology in here, you know, I'm going to lose my job because 50% of my time was cut? How would you address that based on your experience of implementing this? Is there anything else I haven't touched on that I should ask you about this?
No, I think that's high level. I think that covers everything, the majority of it.
Okay. All right. Well, great. Well, thank you, Chris, so much for sharing what an actual implementation is like inside a department of putting in machine learning technology in order to really reframe the work so that you're spending your time on the highest needs of the organization. Is there anything else you'd want to add before we close up, Chris?
Some additional tools that we use here at City within the same data tracing program. We've actually built a tool that automatically compares what's reported, the data that's reported, to the source documentation that we're reviewing. So if the source documentation is in a PDF format, we actually will extract the data from the PDF format and automatically compare it to what's being reported. Again, there we're looking to see if there are any potential exceptions, and we focus on just the potential exceptions and not just, we don't focus on things that are being reported accurately. If it's not in a PDF format, we've created another tool that compares reported data to referential databases. Those referential databases, for example, the securities I mentioned, pull from a third-party vendor like Bloomberg. So that will do the compare of the data by itself automatically to see if logically, if the data elements agree. So the data element that's being reported and the data element on either the referential database or within the customer agreement, the source document.
Now, did you start with that software, or you added that later as you got more efficient? You're like, oh, we could even take this a little further.
Right. So that was step 2 in the process. We had the first tool that would profile the data, identify the records that look odd or unusual. And then step 2 was the tool that's doing the comparison of the data elements. That tool that compares the data elements, we developed in-house. But again, it has multiple different functionalities to allow us to focus on those potential discrepancies.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most important things that comes out of these processes. In the beginning, it's hard to get started, but as you start creating these efficiencies and seeing what technology can do for you, then everybody starts getting more and more creative of like, what else can we do? How can we make this a little better? And really thinking about technology now as being agile, that, 20 years ago when we implemented technology, it was in there forever. And we didn't think we'd have to change out technology for a long time after we purchased it. But now the way technology works, we're in a very agile environment and we keep wanting to improve, improve, improve. So we really have to document our own processes internally so that we know, so that we can keep improving. And I think that's a great example that Chris has shared with us today. So I want to thank Chris for sharing your story, and hopefully it will help those that are watching this video on really thinking through what types of processes you could start applying artificial intelligence and machine learning to. And I look forward to having you watch future episodes. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.